Hey guys, what's going on? Today I have a very special guest, Evan Filarca. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Evan, even though you really do need no introduction.
What's up, true believers and spectacular Spidey fans? Welcome back to another amazing Spider-Man related video, and thank you so much to the one and only Irogen for actually inviting me for this collab. I couldn't be more honored to be here today, so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for being on. It really does mean a lot. I've been watching you since the beginning, so having you on here is really a dream come true. Today we're going to be talking about an interesting topic, which is Evan Filarca, Insomniac shill or hater? No, I'm just kidding.
Woo! I'm ready, dude. Let's go.
Yeah.
It's my time. Yes.
No, so I actually thought that having Evan, who is very much more well versed with the Spider-Man video game history than I am, I thought it would be interesting to back a little bit at some of the previous Spider-Man games, some of the ones that held up very well, like Spider-Man 2, Web of Shadows, Ultimate Spider-Man, that are still revered by fans even after Insomniac's fantastic games, versus maybe some of the ones that didn't do as well, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Edge of Time, some of the less uh, respected ones, I guess is what you'd call them. And then I know that this kind of feels like we're spanning two completely different topics, but applying what worked and what didn't work in the previous games, I thought it would be interesting to look at the future of Insomniac's Spider-Man franchise that they're building, things that maybe they should avoid or stay away from, maybe what Evan and I think their lineup should be. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about some of the past Spider-Man games first. And Evan, what Spider-Man games before the 2018 Insomniac game do you still think hold up? Or if any, do you think any of them hold up?
Oh, I think a bunch of them hold up perfectly. And of course, I have so much thoughts about all these games because I grew up with all of them. I mean, if you guys know me, I'm a huge Spider-Man fan, ride or die. But out of all the forms of media that are out there, with the movies, comics, TV shows, and of course games, I actually do believe that the gaming medium is the best way to portray the character of Spider-Man overall because we get to interact with him directly. We are him, but we also get to experience longer stories, which I think is the cooler thing about video games is that they get to elongate the narratives in such intriguing ways that you wouldn't normally get in an hour and a half to 2 hour long movie or a couple 22-minute long cartoon episodes. And with some of the games that we have seen that are either open world or linear based, like level based types of properties, I really do think that the top five in my own list, ever since the release of even Spider-Man PS4 and recently with Miles Morales, still remains the same. Is the first off, of course, is none other than Spider-Man PS4. Second is Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which I love to death. And if Spider-Man PS4 did not exist, that would be my favorite Spider-Man game of all time. Number three is Ultimate Spider-Man. Number four is actually Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. And number five is the 2000 slash PlayStation 1 Spider-Man game developed by Neversoft. Now, I know that probably is a crime to not put in Spider-Man 2, the movie tie-in game in there, because that's pretty much the foundation for every single open world Spider-Man game to have been made since then, especially with that of Spider-Man PS4. But I think that these other games that I just listed have either perfected or evolved the method of the open world variety type of gameplay formula, or the narrative that was included in the game just surpassed what Spider-Man 2 was for me. And that ranges from just, again, the characterization of Peter Parker being this lovable, geek that can also be kind of nerdy and wacky at times, but also, of course, be a hard-hitting superhero that is willing to get the job done to protect those he cares about. And I think all those games, even though some of them, like Shattered Dimensions, we don't even get to see what Peter Parker looks like, still fully encapsulate what makes the character so special. And again, that ranges from great combat mechanics, really engaging stories, great visuals, amazing music, of course. I'm a big music guy myself, so the soundtracks always stand out for all those games, especially for Ultimate Spider-Man. That is a banger for sure. But encapsulating all these types of gameplay into the character of Spider-Man instead of serving it the opposite. Like, well, we have to take Spider-Man and put him into a game that would just do well as that own property. But in reality, they make a game that serves the character of Spider-Man justice first and foremost. They structure these titles in a way that makes sense for how Spider-Man can actually showcase all of his amazing abilities in ways that gamers can engage with the character in more entertaining ways that you may have not seen before in any other type of form of media. And that's why I think those top 5 for me are my personal favorites.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. I think that Spider-Man 2 did a great job of sort of transitioning Spider-Man into a more open world experience, and they laid a really solid groundwork for future games. It has a really solid story, but I agree that I think that a lot of uh, the games post Spider-Man 2 were able to improve even upon that medium. I know that, for example, even though people never want to talk about Spider-Man 3, that there were improvements made in that game upon Spider-Man 2, even if they weren't from a narrative perspective. But what do you think is sort of the difference? Like, what makes a good Spider-Man game versus a bad Spider-Man game? Because, like, all the ones that you just mentioned are phenomenal, but then we also have games like The Amazing Spider-Man 2, arguably Spider-Man Edge of Time. And one thing that I think is interesting is that Chris Baker, who used to be a Spider-Man game developer, has brought up statements in the past where obviously he hasn't outright said that he hates the games he's worked on or anything, but he's mentioned things along the lines of the development team knew that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was not the greatest Spidey game ever made. And I would be curious to hear your thoughts on what made even the first Amazing Spider-Man game work to a degree where the second one didn't. And I think that money has a lot to do with it. You cannot cut the budget for a Spider-Man game. It just doesn't work. You can't cut the resources or the team in half. But I don't know. Do you think that there are like story elements or gameplay elements that can make or break one of these games? I know that for me personally, um, if there's not enough things to do around the city, if it's an open world game, that can really hinder the experience for me, just as an example.
I think you're absolutely hitting the nail on the head perfectly. You're totally right in that there isn't enough activity going on with, I would say, those 3 games you mentioned, The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, and my personal least favorite game for Spider-Man of all time. It might be considered a hot take. I don't know. Some people do like it. I have not been a fan of it forever, ever since it first came out in 2011, is Spider-Man Edge of Time. In that way, that is, I think, the clear-cut example of how to not make a Spider-Man game. A character like Spider-Man who is known to, I don't know, explore the open world of Manhattan with swinging through different areas with his amazing traversal mechanics with web swinging and wall crawling. And even though that is not a open world game, that's not necessarily the main problem. The primary problem I have is that the entirety of the game's setting takes place in one whole building, the Alchemax building, both
Just
in the
out of
President Campus.
curiosity, sorry to cut you off. Just out of curiosity, do you think that any of that was because of Arkham Asylum? Do you think that Activision looked at Arkham Asylum and the success of that and was sort of trying to influence Beanox to take a page out of Rocksteady's book and set it all in one location and have a linear structure?
Oh, I never really thought of it like that. Maybe that's interesting because yeah, Arkham Asylum came out in 2009, and it was like the first start of that whole franchise from Rocksteady. But
Yeah.
what makes that game so good in comparison to Edge of Time is that you're exploring this engaging setting, the asylum, Arkham Asylum itself, and the island that you're stuck on because you're having, Joker has this grand master plan, trapping Batman there and has to fight all these amazing villains from his rogues gallery in different areas of the asylum. And that makes you as a player more engaged to see what types of secrets you may find scattered throughout this island, especially given the fact that Riddler puts all of his crazy mind-numbing PTSD inducing trophies all over the place trying to collect
Yeah.
those. But it makes you want to explore the island is the thing, is that you want to go to these different sections of the Arkham Asylum and try and find, oh, here's the morgue with Scarecrow and all that. Here's the, kind of the sewer area with Killer Croc. And oh my God, here's this crazy big maintenance building that Joker has made into like a crazy fun house. Like, that's awesome. With Edge of Time, they did nothing. It's just boring floor after monotonous robots, after monotonous guards to fight over and over again. The same soundtrack also plays throughout the entirety of the game as well, which me as a music lover really irritates me immensely. But it could be a linear game, like again, Shattered Dimensions or the first or a couple games from Neversoft that were linear based, level based, and still have you entertained in the way of exploring these areas as Spider-Man. You can swing around. There's also a lot of puzzles involved with both those games, as well as Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time. But they have to be engaging and encapsulating for you as the player to want to solve them and further explore and progress the story to make even more hindrance towards the enemies and their plans, and try and do something that actually makes you feel like the character. Like Batman, you're solving puzzles, you're hacking into consoles, you're going through grates within the walls, the air vents and stuff, so you're kind of sneaking around stealthily. You feel like, the world's greatest detective slash the Dark Knight. You feel like you're Batman. As cliche as that is to say, it's the truth. And same thing with the early, Neversoft games. You're crawling on walls, even though as how, bare bones those games were, you still have your web shooters, you can web swing, you can wall crawl, you have the quips, so you still feel like this amazing hero that we know of to be Spider-Man. But even in Edge of Time, my biggest problem with that game is the story makes no sense whatsoever. The graphics were a huge step back from the stylized visuals that were in Shattered Dimensions, and sticking the entire setting into one building that's the size of literally Mount Everest is bonkers. And the whole narrative with Anti-Venom turning into a discount version of Monster Rock that we saw in the first Neversoft game, and kind of backtracking from the amazing boss fights that we received in Shattered Dimensions, just made it feel Edge of Time like an overall lackluster experience. And that same notion applies as well to the Amazing Spider-Man 2 compared to the first Amazing Spider-Man game, where even though the web swinging was not that great in the first game, since he literally attached to the sky and the sky alone when he was traversing throughout the open world, they still had the really engaging traversal mechanic of the web rush, as well as the, of course, copy and paste Arkham-style combat, but they made it into a way that actually fit well for Spider-Man, his character, in that game. And then they kind of, again, downgraded everything when they made The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Visually, aesthetically, the swinging was a bit better in that game, but not too much. And again, the engagement of that being a movie tie-in game actually allowed to expand upon the overall universe that was set within Andrew Garfield's Amazing Spider-Man movies with the first film. And then the second game, they kind of just barely touched upon that at all. They had Electro and Green Goblin in there, but they mainly focused the main antagonist as Carnage, who was not anywhere near involved in the Amazing Spider-Man 2 movie, but just had him in there as like a cool extra afterthought for his rogues gallery. And I love Carnage, but I thought it was very strange to include him in the game. And also not really doing anything innovative as you would like to see in these types of superhero properties. Like Rocksteady did a great job by expanding Asylum to City to Night in every single installment. And for Beanox with their games, it's like they had a good game and a bad game. Shattered Dimensions was phenomenal. Edge of Time is my least favorite Spider-Man game of all time because they backtracked and kind of downgrade a lot of elements from Shattered Dimensions. Amazing Spider-Man 1 was a pretty good game. It wasn't by any means fantastic, but still managed to convey a really good open world Spider-Man game that we didn't get for 4 years. The last open world game that we got at the time was Web of Shadows. And then returning to that formula with Amazing Spider-Man 1 was actually a welcome, treat. And then they kind of did things in a weird way again with the Amazing Spider-Man 2 by trying to expand on more of the Peter Parker elements of that game and that universe with the character of Spider-Man by focusing more on Peter Parker gameplay segments, but they weren't really as thought out or as layered as we would have liked them to be. Compared to what we did receive in Spider-Man PS4, where Insomniac definitely learned their lesson from those games and took that feedback into consideration when formulating their own interpretation of Peter Parker and their gameplay segments with his character, and Spider-Man and his gameplay segments with that aspect of Peter's character. So there was a lot to learn from all these games, both good and bad, especially with the other superhero properties out there, like from Rocksteady and the Arkham games. But for me, as a hardcore Spider-Man fan, it's clear to see where they went wrong and what they can do going forward, especially now since we're waiting with Miles Morales and how great that was, and now moving forward into the inevitable sequel for the PlayStation 5.
Yeah. Yep. I think that you bring up a lot of really good points, and it's kind of interesting some of the things that can make or break a Spidey game. Like, for example, as you mentioned, an open world is not necessarily what makes or breaks it. You can have a linear Spider-Man game as long as you get a lot of the other elements right. And you definitely do want to do justice to the character. I always enjoy seeing what villains they can bring into the mix, but I like them to be done well, not like Carnage, where the symbiote wasn't even really established in that universe whatsoever, and then they're throwing us Carnage. Uh, and also, like I mentioned, you don't want to cut the resources or the budget on a Spider-Man game like they did with the Amazing Spider-Man 2, because I don't think that does anybody any favors. It doesn't do the fans any favors. It doesn't do the developers any favors, as we can tell from some of the developers who clearly were not loving the experience of working on that game. and then it doesn't really do the publisher any favors because then the game simply doesn't sell well. So now looking forward into the future for Insomniac's Spider-Man franchise, I'd kind of just briefly like to hear, and I'll give mine as well, but kind of hear your lineup of what you think they should do with the future installments, what new game mechanics they might want to introduce. Because as you mentioned, there does need to be some form of evolution. I think that if they just copy and paste what they did previously with Spider-Man PS4 and Miles Morales, people are going to start getting a little bit fatigued. So I'm interested to hear what innovations you think they could add, maybe what villains they should include, or maybe some story elements that they should stay away from. Uh, what pieces of this franchise should they maybe not explore, or even from a more quantitative perspective, like is there a certain number of games that you think they should eventually stop at? Yeah, give me your rundown really quick.
For sure. And it's great that you bring that up because of how Insomniac is 2 for 2 at this point. They have nailed it so much and so in so little time, honestly, from 2018 to 2020. I mean, that's a 2-year gap, but they still managed to completely evolve the formula even more from the first game to Miles Morales. And again, that's because of the fact that now they are a first party studio for Sony Interactive Entertainment, so they now have more resources to make these games even better. Unlike what you mentioned previously, Beanox, where they were cut their budget and they had to rush development for the Amazing Spider-Man 2 in comparison to the Amazing Spider-Man 1. So that's a big factor right off the bat as to why that game didn't shape up as well as the previous installment. But now it's clear to see that Sony knows how popular Spider-Man is, obviously, but especially how well these games have done. Of course, as we already know, Spider-Man PS4 sold over 20 million copies worldwide, and recently it was confirmed that Miles Morales sold over 4 million copies since November of 2020 when it came out, and now it's February of 2021. So only, like 4 months since its main launch, and it's done insanely well for a character who hasn't been around yet, even for a full decade with Miles. So that's crazy, especially seeing how Insomniac evolved the gameplay again with his Venom powers, the invisibility with the camo, all that, and the swing tricks, especially the traversal, was so clean and so fresh in Miles compared to the first game, where, of course, the air tricks were a bit stiff, granted, for Peter and his movements, but to fairness, that is because Insomniac said that they actually didn't incorporate the air tricks into Peter's moveset until late in development, whereas for Miles, they actually incorporated that first off when developing his traversal compared to Peter's, which is where I don't think we have to worry about that too much for the sequel, considering how obviously, as to what was teased at the end of Miles Morales and even the first game, is that the symbiote is going to have a factor. Of course, the symbiote is most likely going to be involved with the sequel in Insomniac's universe, likely going on to Peter, turning him into black-suited Spider-Man. And this is what I need Insomniac to nail on a gameplay front, on a graphic front, visually, and of course on a story front. How is the symbiote going to impact Peter and his livelihood? Of course, the best stories, like they've said from Marvel Games, Vice President Bill Roseman, is where the worlds of Peter Parker and Spider-Man collide. Having that duality clash with one another makes you as a player more engaged into his life. And how they've already established Peter's character so well in the first game, and now with Miles in the first game as well as his own game, makes you even more connected to this cast of characters. So having this kind of malicious aspect be incorporated into a character who's so heroic and so genuine as Peter Parker, and how that could affect him mentally and emotionally as well as physically with making him stronger, is getting me as a player amped up. And I need them to perfect it, or else I will actually have a problem with the game, because me personally, I'm a little bit biased to the black suit. That is my personal favorite Spider-Man costume in the comics ever made. The narrative reasoning behind it, what it means and represents for a character as good as Spider-Man, and how it can kind of cause that whole moral of with great power comes great responsibility. What if you have too much power? And what does that do for someone like Spider-Man is super engaging for me as a narrative, enthusiast with these games, and seeing how that could influence the narrative going forward with Peter's character is a huge draw for me. And of course, that relates to the gameplay as well. He's obviously going to be faster, stronger, maybe more angry and aggressive when he's fighting compared to more, kind of, bashful and graceful he is. The acrobatic improviser, as Brian Intaro has labeled him in the previous games. How is that going to affect his overall combat aesthetic once he equips this aggressive symbiote / substance on him, which we'll talk about in another video down the line? And
Yeah,
especially
I
now
should have mentioned that. I should have mentioned we're also going to be doing a video for Evan's channel. Go check that out. I'll link it in the description below. Sorry again. Continue.
and it'll be pure hype, no worries. And for this, it's going to be so neat to see how they incorporate that for the narrative and the gameplay. And maybe if they want to go crazy with it, it could swap between Peter and Miles. Who knows? Symbiote Black Suit Spider-Man for Peter or Symbiote Black Suit Spider-Man for Miles. We have no idea. Again, that's the whole indication, is that they can do whatever they want at this point with the story, especially considering the fact that Harry Osborn looks like to be the one to become Venom instead of Eddie Brock. So that's already a huge, step in a different direction that not a lot of people are familiar with, and that hypes me up to the nth degree. Like, I cannot wait to see how they actually tackle that subject and that narrative plot with Harry and Peter, especially how well good friends they are known to be within this universe and just in general, and seeing how that could draw some real emotional tension between Peter and Miles and Harry and even Mary Jane and all these other supporting characters that could be in the game. It gets me super pumped to see where that goes, especially for the gameplay. Again, I want, maybe if they just go into the route of Web of Shadows, the sequel, if they just double down like the crazy symbiote powers and tendril attacks and stuff like that, if they do that or make it something more realistic where, crazy enough, I'm going to reference Spider-Man 3, where they had that symbiote in that game, and instead of using like Shattered Dimensions where the tentacles come out and he bursts out crazy symbiote attacks out of the wazoo, they could just make him stronger and more aggressive with the combos that he utilizes when fighting enemies. And maybe instead of using less webbing, he could use more of his fists and, aggressive attacks to make him more ferocious. And that gets me super excited to see how they could utilize the powers and the upgrade system to make it more, various in terms of combat. We already had that with Miles, where you can use the Venom powers or your webs or gadgets or invisibility or air combat or ground combat. And the same thing here with Peter. He has his gadgets and air combat and wall combat and ground combat, bouncing from wall to wall and using the environment as well is also a fun thing. But again, how can they evolve that even further? That's where the rumor kind of came in recently, where the setting could be different overall from New York to Tokyo, Japan. And there's been no hints in either games that they are going into Japan. But if the setting were to change, that would be a huge different factor that we haven't seen in any Spider-Man game, since it's always taken place in New York City. So if they were to make the open world a totally different, country with Japan, Tokyo, that would be crazy. And seeing how that could affect possibly how he could traverse and the people he has to protect, and maybe different characters that to explore within the Marvel universe, that is also very engaging as well. If that rumor turns out to be true, the symbiote gameplay is obviously going to be a huge drawing power of the PS5, and of course, I missed, if I were not to mention at least once, the brand new face of Peter Parker, where Jake did a great video the other day about the PR about new for Peter and his involvement with the remaster. But we do know, of course, that this is going to be the new look of going forward franchise, of course, with the inevitable. So, and how engaged I was with the first game was because of Yuri Lowenthal and his performance, bringing the character of Peter and actually attaching that to John Bubniak's character model. So now that we have as our new Peter with the same man, voice Lowenthal, the emotional attachment with this version of Peter Parker is still there by the time that he has his own continue within the sequel. And that, again, overall, from the gameplay perspective, graphic quality, and narrative conclusions, that gets me super hyped to see where this entire next.
Yeah. Yeah, I think absolutely. You make so many good points. I've always thought that Insomniac really just did such a great job with that first game. But with that said, I don't know that it's the definitive Spider-Man game. I think that that will be Spider-Man 2. Just by looking at the characters that they can include. They can include Green Goblin, Mysterio, Sandman, um, Harry Osborn. They can expand Peter's circle of friends. You could introduce Flash Thompson, Liz Allen, Gwen Stacy, all of these different characters. And then on top of that, you have Miles and his whole arc and what he's going through. And I think that everything that you mentioned is absolutely perfect. I've always been sort of the opinion that maybe Venom shouldn't be the big bad until the third game, just so that they can properly build him up. But I don't know what route they're going to take with him, if it is indeed going to be Harry Osborn, or if they're going to try and switch it over to Eddie Brock somehow. I don't know what they're planning to do there. But I've always thought that maybe they should do like a second game that's just Green Goblin versus Symbiote Spider-Man. Whoever does get the symbiote, whether it's Peter or Miles, I would like to have a boss fight against them as the other Spider-Man. And I don't know. There's so many awesome things that they could do, so many avenues that they haven't explored yet. What I will say is that I think that they should do at least 2 more Peter Parker based Spider-Man games. I'd like to see Spider-Man 2 and then Spider-Man 3, which maybe could be more of a Spider-Man game. It could be interesting to see what kind of gameplay they could bring to the table if they introduced some kind of multiplayer or something. That would really change up the dynamics of the game. If they went sort of in a Gotham Knights route where you could play as Peter Parker and then your friend could play as Miles through the story, that might be a change that not everyone would like. But it would most certainly be a very interesting direction and something that we haven't really ever seen in a Spider-Man game, especially an open world one. I've also always been of the impression that Insomniac should stop when they are kind of done. In other words, if they make Spider-Man 3 and they realize we're done, we've kind of said everything that we want to say here, then I don't think that they should jump in and make a 4th game just because the sales are good. I'll play as many games as they make, obviously, because I'm a huge fan, but I think that there's a very real problem when developers keep going even after they're fatigued with an IP. So I think that depending on, Spider-Man 3, 4, 5, once we start getting down into that range, and who knows how far they're going to get, once they do start feeling that fatigue, I just assume they maybe move on to another IP, another Marvel character, or maybe find a way to reinvent the Spider-Man games. Maybe they could open their own multiverse somehow. But basically, I just want to keep the games fresh. I don't want it to turn into Assassin's Creed where they just keep pumping out repetitive games, which I don't think will be the case. I have a lot of faith in Insomniac on that front. And also, they've sort of, I wouldn't say that it's gone against the norm, but they've added a lot of spin-off titles in this, or at least they've created a lot of potential for spin-off titles with Miles Morales. Of course, they haven't made any more than that yet, but you look at some of the characters that could get spin-off games. They could do Miles Morales 2. They could do a prequel where you get to play through the first week of Peter Parker getting his powers. They could do a Venom spin-off game. There are so many different things that they could do, and I'm just really excited to see what they can do. So Evan, do you have any closing thoughts before we head out on this one?
Someone initially said that they want an Aunt May spinoff game, and I just cried because she's no longer with us. So I'm like, wow, that'd be intense. But I'm like, damn. So if they do
Aunt May in the
anything like that, I
afterlife.
would be infurious, but also maybe I don't know. But yeah, if they just utilize the property as much as they're doing right now to the betterment again of to serve the character justice, not just to make it just because people want a Miles Morales game, so we're going to do that because people want. No, they do it because they want to continue the narrative that they set forth and also engage players with a Spider-Man who deserves pretty much his own game, his own unique story in a way that would do him justice, just like Into the Spider-Verse did, and that's what Miles Morales did. And again, seeing how wonderful they nailed both characters with Peter Parker and Miles Morales has the utmost confidence in myself as a fan, assured that whatever game or property that they tackle next, even if it is within the Marvel realm, if they stop doing Spider-Man games and do like a Daredevil game or Hulk or something else, I would be totally down for it.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, it's going to be really interesting. It seems like they're setting up a symbiote arc for Peter Parker. And one of my critiques, honestly, with the first game was that I sometimes felt like he was almost a little too resilient. He made the right choice every single time, it seemed like, and it seemed like he recovered from things really quickly. And I mean, on its own, that is a critique for me. But then if in a sequel we start seeing him get overtaken by the influence of the symbiote or something, that would be really awesome. But yeah, so a lot of really awesome stuff to look forward to. Evan, thank you so much for joining me on this video, and I'll look forward to collaborating with you a lot more down the road.
Thank you so much for having me, Irogen. I cannot thank you enough for inviting me on to our amazing channel. And please, everyone watching, go follow and subscribe to him right now because he definitely deserves all your support and he definitely deserves it as much as you could possibly think of. So again, dude, thank you so much for having me.
Yep, thanks.